BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Luke Tottenham. Good evening. Labour has pledged to rescue the NHS with a massive investment programme, but it's endured a difficult day on the election trail, with senior figures saying contradictory things about key policies. First, the Shadow Chancellor and Shadow Health Secretary gave conflicting messages on plans to introduce a 4-day working week. Then Jeremy Corbyn sparked confusion over his policy on a second independence referendum for Scotland. Boris Johnson has told voters in the West Midlands, seen as one of the election's main battlegrounds, that British workers should be prioritised when it comes to jobs on public projects. But earlier in the day, he was accused of doing nothing to help the victims of floods that have submerged parts of northern England and the East Midlands. Royal Mail has won a High Court injunction to block potential strikes by postal workers, with the judge saying they could have an impact on the general election. The first public hearings in Donald Trump's impeachment inquiry have begun in Washington. Labour has announced details of its flagship policy for the election, a major injection of funding for the health service, including a pledge to spend £6 billion a year more than the Conservatives on the NHS in England by 2024. Labour has described the investment as the second biggest boost in healthcare spending after the Blair-Brown years, and says it will pay for the increased budget by raising taxes for the highest earners and reversing cuts to corporation tax. But Labour has been criticised after two shadow cabinet ministers contradicted each other as they launched the policy over whether plans for a 4-day working week would apply to the NHS. And the head of the Unite Union, Len McCluskey, a key backer of Jeremy Corbyn, has tonight warned that Labour should not relax rules on free movement for foreign health workers. Here's our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
In what is likely to form the centrepiece of their election campaign, Labour today pledged a huge spending boost for the NHS to reverse what they called the decade of decay, a £40 billion cash injection over the next 4 years that would go towards recruiting 24,000 more nurses, 1,500 more GPs, free prescriptions and a £15 billion hospital rebuilding programme. There'd also be a major focus on mental health, with more specialist ambulances, the replacement of old-style dormitories and a mental health counsellor in every secondary school. They also promised to reverse private sector provision of NHS services, a package the Shadow Health Secretary John Ashworth claimed would rebuild the health service.
Let me be clear. There will be a credible plan for more nurses, more midwives, more allied health professionals and practitioners. We will safeguard the NHS, the quality care patients deserve. A rescue plan for our NHS. Change is coming for patients and NHS staff. Vote Labour for our NHS. Thank you very much.
Mr Ashworth also confirmed that freedom of movement, under which EU nationals can work and settle in the UK without any restrictions, would continue to apply for those who chose to work in the health service. But Mr Ashworth found himself at odds with the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell after he said the party's promise to introduce a 4-day week over the next decade would not apply in the NHS. A stance contradicted by Mr McDonnell, who said it remained a realistic ambition. Mr McDonnell also suggested Labour's ambitious spending plans could be funded by raising taxes on the rich.
The day-to-day spending increase will be funded by taxing, yes, the top 5% at a higher rate of income tax. And let me just make this clear. Income tax rates, national insurance and VAT will not increase for 90% of earners.
However, said Mr McDonnell, those earning more than £80,000 would, under Labour, pay the 45p rate, and those earning more than £125,000 would pay a new 50p rate. If elections are often won and lost depending on the issue that dominates, then Labour must now hope that they can trump Boris Johnson's "Let's get Brexit done" with their own key pledge, "Let's rescue the NHS."
Jeremy Corbyn has moved to clarify when a Labour government would consider allowing the Scottish Parliament to hold another independence referendum, after suggesting this morning he'd rule out such a move during his first term as Prime Minister. The Labour leader insisted his policy was to reject calls for a vote in the first few years of a Labour government, later telling reporters, "I think the confusion is with you, not me." Our Scotland correspondent James Shaw reports from Glasgow.
It was not a comfortable start to Jeremy Corbyn's two-day visit to Scotland. Arriving at a campaign event in Glasgow, he was approached by a heckler who accused him of being a terrorist sympathiser.
Do you think the man that's going to be Prime Minister of this country should be a terrorist sympathiser, Mr Corbyn? Who's going to be the first terrorist invited to the House of Commons when you're Prime Minister?
The protester turned out to be a local Church of Scotland minister. At the event itself, Mr Corbyn talked about his plan to invest more than £70 billion to start a green industrial revolution in Scotland and about legislation to protect tenants in the private sector. He also seemed to suggest a shift in Labour's policy on whether or not to allow a second independence referendum. He said there wouldn't be a vote in the first term of a Labour government. But then later, speaking to the BBC's politics editor in Scotland, Brian Taylor, he returned to the formulation he's used before, that there would be no vote in the early years of a new administration.
In the early years of a Labour government, I want to concentrate totally on investment all across the UK, including the $70 billion that I want to put in. It means saying in the early years, let's say no to that. Let's concentrate on what matters.
These apparently fine distinctions could matter because the leader of the SNP, Nicola Sturgeon, will only support a minority Labour government if it authorises a referendum within a timeframe which suits her.
Jeremy Corbyn attempted to say no to giving the people of Scotland the right to choose their own future today. It took a morning for that position to crumble and to be rowed back by his aides. And my message to people in Scotland is, if you think it's really important as a point of principle that it should be Scotland that chooses our own future, then we've got an opportunity not just to see that position of opposition crumble, but to wash it away with a massive vote for the SNP in this election.
This was never going to be an easy election for Labour in Scotland. In previous contests, voters have defected in droves to the SNP. Ambiguity about a second independence referendum may not bring them back.
Jeremy Corbyn has said capturing the leader of the Islamic State group, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, would have been the right thing to do if it had been possible. Baghdadi died alongside 3 of his children during a raid by US forces in Syria. Mr Corbyn said removing the IS leader from the scene was a very good thing, but people like him needed to be put on trial at the International Court of Justice. Boris Johnson has returned